What happens when a talk show host tries to mock a Hollywood legend like Clint Eastwood on live TV? You won't believe how he responds, leaving the entire studio in stunned silence. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more incredible stories like this. Now, let's get into it. Clint Eastwood's response will leave you speechless. Hollywood is a place of legends, a world where icons are born and stories are immortalized. But it is also a place where the old ways are constantly challenged, where the industry moves fast, often leaving behind those who fail to keep up. Clint Eastwood, a name synonymous with cinematic greatness, a man who has defined entire generations of storytelling, walked onto the stage of a highly anticipated talk show. At over 90 years old, he remained as formidable as ever, his presence commanding, his posture straight, and his signature piercing gaze unwavering. The audience erupted in cheers as he took his seat. There was something timeless about him. Even as Hollywood evolved, even as the faces on the big screen changed with each passing decade, Clint Eastwood remained a constant force, an enduring reminder of an era when films were raw, powerful, and built on grit rather than CGI spectacle. His career had spanned over half a century, yet he was still here, still directing, still acting, still shaping the very art form he had helped define. The interview started in a cordial manner. The host, a charismatic yet sharp-tongued media personality, seemed genuinely respectful at first. He asked Clint about his latest projects, about the challenges of directing films in an era so vastly different from the one he had started in. Clint, ever the professional, responded with calm authority, sharing insights about storytelling, about his passion for filmmaking, and about why he had never considered stepping away from the industry. His voice, deep and measured, carried the weight of experience, each word spoken with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. But then something shifted. The conversation took a turn, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. The host, leaning slightly forward, his smile carrying a hint of mischief, changed his tone ever so slightly. He chuckled before speaking, as if setting up for a well-rehearsed punchline. And then, with an air of playful condescension, he asked the question that would alter the course of the interview. "Clint, you're over 90 now. You've had a legendary career, no one can deny that. But don't you think it's time to step aside? To let the younger generation take over?" The words hung in the air for a moment, and the atmosphere in the studio subtly shifted. The audience, initially caught up in the light-hearted energy of the show, grew quiet. Some exchanged glances. Others leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. The question, though delivered with a smile, had an edge to it, a challenge disguised as casual banter. Clint Eastwood didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, his expression unreadable. A man like him had heard it all before, had faced critics and doubters throughout his entire life. But at that moment, it wasn't just about defending himself. It was about something far greater. It was about the idea that age somehow dictated value, that experience could be dismissed in favor of youth, that a lifetime of mastery could be overshadowed by mere novelty. And when he finally spoke, his response was one that no one in that room would ever forget. The silence that followed the host's question was almost deafening. The atmosphere in the studio, which had been light and lively just moments before, suddenly felt charged with anticipation. Some audience members exchanged uneasy glances, while others leaned in, eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood, waiting for his reaction. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, a provocation wrapped in polite words, laced with an undertone that suggested Clint was past his prime, that maybe, just maybe, he was holding on to something he should have already let go of. The host, sensing the tension, attempted to maintain his grin, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, perhaps a realization that he had just stepped onto shaky ground. He tapped his fingers against the desk in front of him, as if trying to fill the silence, but Clint made no immediate effort to respond. Instead, he simply sat there, his gaze locked onto the man across from him. His expression was calm, unreadable, yet there was a weight behind his silence, an unspoken challenge of his own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clint shifted in his seat. His movement was deliberate, slow, measured. He exhaled, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. And then, in that deep, gravelly voice that had defined some of the most legendary characters in cinema, he finally spoke. "You know," he began, his tone casual, yet carrying an unmistakable authority, "it's funny how people always assume that just because a person gets older, they suddenly stop having something to offer. Like experience just evaporates. Like passion disappears." His words were not spoken in anger, nor were they defensive. They were matter of fact, a simple truth laid bare. The audience, sensing the shift in power dynamics, was completely silent now. The host, who had initially seemed so confident in his question, was suddenly less sure of himself. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "You see, when I was younger, I never sat around asking older men when they were going to step aside. I was too busy learning from them," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "John Ford, Sergio Leone, Don Siegel, those guys didn't quit just because someone younger came along. They didn't stop creating just because the industry kept moving. And guess what? No one told them they should." The host swallowed, clearly taken aback. The smugness that had been there just moments ago was now gone. Clint leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the armrests of his chair, as if preparing to deliver the final blow. "You asked me if I think it's time to step aside," he said, his voice even lower now, forcing the entire room to hang on to every syllable. "I don't know. Do you think people still come to watch my films? Do you think they still care about the stories I tell?" There was no need to answer. The very fact that the audience was here, that millions of people around the world still flocked to see his movies, that his name alone carried weight, was proof enough. Clint let the question linger, allowing the reality of it to settle in before delivering the final, devastating remark. "The thing is," he said, leaning back, "people don't get old because of their age. They get old when they stop doing what they love." A murmur spread through the audience. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a statement, a lesson wrapped in a single sentence. The host shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that he had underestimated the man sitting across from him. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor, a director, or a legend. He was a force, a man who had seen it all, done it all, and still had more to give. And in that moment, as the applause began to ripple through the room, it was clear that no one, not even a sharp-tongued talk show host, could tell him otherwise. For a moment, the studio felt frozen in time. The weight of Clint Eastwood's words hung in the air, a quiet but undeniable reminder that experience, passion, and mastery were not things that could simply be discarded. The host, who had moments ago been in control of the conversation, now found himself on unsteady ground. His usual wit and charm, the weapons he relied on to steer interviews in his favor, were suddenly useless against the sheer presence of the man sitting across from him. But the host wasn't ready to back down just yet. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as he tried to regain control. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "I suppose there's something to be said for longevity. But surely, Mr. Eastwood, you must admit that Hollywood is changing. The industry is moving faster than ever, new technologies, new faces, new audiences. Don't you think there's a time when even legends have to step aside and let the new generation take over?" It was a desperate attempt to reframe the conversation, but Clint Eastwood wasn't a man easily backed into a corner. He tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely amused by the persistence of the question. Then, in that slow, deliberate manner that had made him famous, he responded, "You know, people have been saying Hollywood is changing since the day I started," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. "Back in the 50s, they said westerns were dying. In the 60s, they said old-school tough guys were finished. In the 70s, they said the studios were collapsing. And every time, Hollywood didn't die. It just found new ways to tell stories." The audience was completely hooked now, hanging on to every word. Clint let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. "I've never been interested in trends. Never cared about what was in or what was out. Because trends fade. But a good story? A good story lasts forever." The host opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "You want to know what's funny?" he said, leaning in slightly. "People love to talk about the new generation. But you ever notice how many of them still grow up watching my movies? A ripple of laughter and applause spread through the audience. The host let out an awkward chuckle, clearly aware that he was losing ground. Clint, ever the sharpshooter, had turned the conversation into something much bigger than just himself. This wasn't just about whether he should step aside. This was about the idea that age somehow made a person irrelevant, that experience was something to be discarded rather than valued. And that idea? Clint Eastwood had just shot it down without breaking a sweat. The host was visibly uneasy now, shifting in his chair as if he could physically escape the corner Clint Eastwood had backed him into. What had started as a light-hearted jab at the actor's age had now transformed into something much more significant. A battle of ideology, a clash between the fleeting obsession with youth and the undeniable power of experience. Still, unwilling to concede defeat, the host forced another smile and attempted to pivot. "That's a fair point," he admitted, choosing his words more carefully now. "But Hollywood is a business, after all. Studios want fresh faces, new ideas. Audiences are changing. Wouldn't it be wise to acknowledge that, at some point, even the greats have to step back and make room for what's next?" Clint Eastwood exhaled, slow and steady, as if he had been waiting for exactly this kind of question. The hint of a smirk played at the edge of his lips, and for the first time, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests. His presence, already commanding, became even more intense. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice dropping just enough to force everyone to listen. "I've never believed in stepping aside just because someone else says I should. I've never believed in handing over something I love just to make room for the next guy. That's not how this works." The host blinked, caught off guard by the absolute certainty in Clint's voice. "You know what happens when you step aside," Clint continued. "You get forgotten. You get replaced. And if that's what someone wants, fine. Let them fade away. But me?" He paused, his sharp gaze locked onto the host. "I don't fade." The words were like a gunshot in the stillness of the studio. The audience erupted into cheers, and even the crew members standing behind the cameras exchanged glances, fully aware that they were witnessing a moment that would go viral within hours. The host had no comeback. He had tried to frame Clint Eastwood as a relic of the past, but Clint had flipped the narrative on its head. He wasn't just relevant, he was timeless. He wasn't clinging to the past, he was proving that the past had built something unshakable. The host, finally understanding that he had lost this battle, let out a nervous laugh. "Well, Clint, I guess there's no arguing with that," he admitted, throwing his hands up in defeat. Clint simply leaned back in his chair, his job done. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to say anything more. The message had been delivered loud and clear. As the show cut to commercial, the audience still buzzing from what they had just witnessed, it became abundantly clear. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legend because of what he had done. He was a legend because he refused to be anything less. As the show cut to commercial, the energy in the room remained electric. The host, usually the one in control, sat there with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, clearly aware that he had underestimated the man across from him. Clint Eastwood, in just a few words, had not only defended his own legacy, but had also challenged an entire industry's obsession with youth and reinvention. When the cameras returned, the host attempted to regain his footing. "All right," he said, forcing a chuckle. "I think it's safe to say that Clint Eastwood isn't going anywhere anytime soon." The audience responded with laughter and applause, though everyone knew the moment that truly mattered had already happened. Clint, ever the professional, simply nodded. He wasn't the type to bask in the aftermath of a victory. To him, this wasn't a debate to be won. It was just another opportunity to state a truth that so many seemed to forget. The conversation shifted to his latest project, a new film he had recently directed. As he spoke, his passion was evident. Despite the years, despite the industry's changes, his love for storytelling remained unchanged. And that, more than anything, was why he was still here. The interview wrapped up soon after, but the impact of the exchange lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Within hours, clips of Clint's response flooded social media. People dissected every word, praising not just his sharp wit, but the philosophy behind it. Comments poured in. Clint Eastwood just schooled an entire generation in less than 5 minutes. This man doesn't just act in westerns. He is the last cowboy. Age doesn't make you irrelevant. Losing your passion does. For younger audiences, it was a wake-up call. For older fans, it was a validation. And for Hollywood, it was a reminder that legends don't fade, they endure. In the days that followed, Clint went right back to work, proving once again that he didn't just talk about passion, he lived it. While others debated whether he should step aside, he was already planning his next project, as if the question itself had never even been worth answering. Because for Clint Eastwood, there was no such thing as too old. There was only the next story to tell, the next challenge to take on, the next frontier to conquer. And as long as there was still a camera rolling, a script worth bringing to life, and an audience willing to listen, he would be right there, doing what he had always done. Not fading, not stepping aside, just riding forward like he always had. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the impact of Clint Eastwood's words continued to ripple across the industry. The interview was supposed to be just another promotional stop, routine media appearance to discuss his latest film. Instead, it had turned into something far more significant, an undeniable statement about resilience, purpose, and the refusal to be cast aside. Within hours, clips of the exchange dominated social media. News outlets picked up the story, analyzing every word, every pause, every unwavering glance Clint had given. Fans flooded online forums, sharing their admiration for a man who had spent over 6 decades defying expectations. Some praised his wisdom. This is exactly why Clint Eastwood is still making films. He understands that greatness doesn't expire. Others marveled at his sheer presence. No CGI, no special effects, just one man, a lifetime of experience, and a voice that silences a room. Even Hollywood insiders chimed in, with younger actors expressing how much they had learned from him, not just through his films, but through his unshakable philosophy on life. But it wasn't just fans who took notice. Industry veterans, directors, producers, many of whom had worked with Clint or admired him from afar, began echoing his sentiment. A well-known filmmaker tweeted, "Hollywood has an obsession with what's new." But people like Eastwood prove that timeless storytelling is more valuable than temporary trends. Meanwhile, the talk show host himself remained noticeably quiet. Perhaps he realized the misstep he had made in underestimating Clint. Or perhaps, like so many others, he had been given something to reflect on, something that extended beyond a single interview. Yet, while the world debated his words, Clint Eastwood was already moving forward. He wasn't scrolling through social media or reveling in the viral fame. He wasn't caught up in the noise. He was back on set, finalizing the details of his next film, just as he had always done. Because for Clint, that was the only response that mattered. Not words, not debates, not proving a point, just action. And that, more than anything, was why he remained one of the last true legends. Because while others talked about making history, he simply continued to live it.